This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. At the halfway point of his presidency, Gustavo Petro is still trying to deliver on his vision for a more equal and secure Colombia, while also dealing with a lack of confidence among the investor community. What can we expect from Petro's next 2 years in office?
Colombians are very conservative, no matter their political or ideological preference. Colombians tend to oppose change. We prefer the certainty of the known, and as this is the first left-wing government in Colombian modern history, Petro's government might feel as leap into the void of the unknown. And that's part of the reasons why many Colombians have this very deep mistrust on President Petro's.
Gustavo Petro is now halfway through his presidential term in Colombia, and it's been a tumultuous period. The first leftist president in Colombia's modern history faced suspicion from the political and economic establishment from day one. He's used grand, sweeping rhetoric to describe his plans for an economic overhaul, as well as his total peace security initiatives. But in practice, Petro has struggled to translate those speeches and tweets into reality. He did pass an important tax reform early on. Some areas of the country have seen improved security, and deforestation has also fallen since Petro came to power. But apart from that, Petro has fallen short on his plans to remake Colombia's healthcare system or its energy matrix. Meanwhile, Colombia's GDP grew just 0.6% last year, and investors, both foreign and domestic, have been very wary, with fixed investment now at its lowest level since 2005. Today on the podcast, we want to do a broad overview of Petro's government so far, trying to separate rhetoric from reality, to the extent that's possible in politics anyway. We'd like to understand areas where his government has seen some success and also identify challenges and risks in his remaining 2 years in office. We've got the perfect guest to walk us through all that, the very knowledgeable Laura Lizarazo. She's the senior analyst for the Andean region at Control Risks Global Risk Analysis. Laura, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks a lot for having me here.
Laura, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a government that is now at its halfway point. In the broadest possible sense, how would you describe the first 2 years of the Petro government?
I would say that this is a government that has delivered mixed results and that has produced mixed feelings among voters, media, and industries, the private sector. The government has very ambitious policy goals and has intended to balance all these priorities and reforms at the same time with very little political capital that has been wearing out in the past 2 years, but the government has still managed to achieve some policy milestones that have its agenda still alive. So the government of Gustavo Petro will most probably be remembered because of this mixed style in governing and delivering policy outcomes.
Laura, when you look at this government from the outside in, there are really three main areas that people look at. One of them is kind of the reform agenda. Another one is their management of the economy. And then a third area is security. I want to talk to you about the economy first, because that's really where I hear kind of the strongest impressions, and they tend to be negative. I'm talking about the investment community in particular. I talk to them. I know you talk to them a lot as well. The numbers around investment in Colombia are just really difficult. You look at gross fixed investment, that's currently at its lowest level in Colombia since 2005. Now, there was a decline that started prior to Petro taking office, but it has continued to sink under his watch. What do you hear from the investment community in Colombia? Why are they so negative? And do you think their impression is correct? Do you think they've got it right?
Well, opinions vary a lot among industries and according to investors' risk appetite and tolerance. For instance, we see a high level of concern among extractive industries, extractive investors, particularly oil, gas, and mining, which are at the core not only of the Colombian economy, but of the transformation agenda that Petro is currently pursuing. But on the other hand, Colombia is still a very attractive investment destination in several segments of those same industries. For instance, we have seen modest but still significant growth in gas offshore exploration projects, which is one of the key segments that this government will prioritize in the extractive industry. I would say that investors do have several reasons to have certain degree of mistrust or distrust regarding Petro's government, basically due to his very confrontational discourse, very confrontational rhetoric sometimes. But Colombia has very strong macroeconomic fundamentals and macroeconomic policy that will certainly help investors and the country navigate this high degree of uncertainty that we have seen under Petro.
I feel like I've spent 2 years trying to understand precisely why so many of the people I talk to about Colombia, both Colombian investors and foreign investors, are so pessimistic. Because as you know, Laura, it's not like the pillars of Colombia's macroeconomic stability have been abandoned. As a matter of fact, a lot of the macroeconomic management has been fairly solid. I have wondered if some of it comes from the fact that he is the first modern leftist to be president in Colombia, and that there's just an inherent mistrust in that, particularly given the fact that Colombia has had a front row seat to the disaster next door in Venezuela and therefore might be even more sensitive to that. I've wondered if perhaps Petro's uniquely skeptical stance on oil and mining, as you mentioned, maybe some of the negative sentiment in those sectors has bled into kind of the at-large view of Colombia. What do you think? I mean, are either of those two theses that I just mentioned, do they make sense?
Absolutely. That is perfectly in line, I think, is one of the reasons behind this deep suspicion or aversion against Petro, which is we have a strong legacy of violence driven by a guerrilla warfare over the past 6 decades in the country. And this was a left wing armed project that has left many victims in the country, which is a very painful past that is still alive in many ways. We also have that Colombians are very conservative in general, no matter their political or ideological preference. Colombians tend to oppose change. We prefer the certainty of the known. And as this is the first left wing government in Colombian modern history, Petro's government might feel as leap into the void of the unknown. And that's part of the reasons why many Colombians have this very deep mistrust on President Petro. We also have seen the complex and also mixed results of left-wing governments in the region in the past 2 decades. And we are one of the key neighbors of Venezuela. We have also faced some part of the costs of the failures of that regime and that governing model in our neighboring countries. So that helps explain this deep feelings against Petro, even though he has not made any structural radical change as many people have feared in the past 2 years. Maybe those fears have been overstated among several actors.
So I like to listen to people and I like to challenge people. And in my conversations, I have in an effort to understand what's happening in Colombia, I've made points similar to the ones that you just made, said, well, look, nothing dramatic has changed yet. And what I inevitably hear is they say, the key word is yet. And it's this idea that President Petro will at some point lash out and reveal his true face. And that's when the moment of a really radical transformation would come. There have been a couple things this year that would seem to reinforce that possibility, including President Petro's desire to have a constituent assembly, to write a new constitution. He has also urged his supporters to take the streets in order to support his government and his reform agenda.
Well, I think that even though President Petro, even if he has the real intent to pursue this institutional or even extra institutional paths towards completely transforming the social foundations and social pact that informs Colombian politics, economy, and society, he does not have the capabilities or the resources to do so. Even if he wants to pursue a constituent assembly, he has to go through Congress. And the balance of power in Congress does not favor the government at the moment. He does not have the political leverage or the popularity to resort to a mass mobilization to push for his agenda.
Polling shows him somewhere between 35 and 40%. That's not that low. And matter of fact, most leaders around the world are kind of in that space, but it's lower than the 60% or so he had when he took office back in 2022. And it doesn't seem like the kind of approval rating that you need to write a new constitution, for example.
Absolutely. And even if he did have stronger, higher approval ratings, drafting a new constitution is a very uncertain process, as we have seen in Chile, for instance. The process that country followed was the opposite that President Petro is trying to pursue in Colombia. The overhaul of the Chilean constitution came or was triggered after a mass national mobilization demanding for that transformation, whereas in Colombia, we do not have that same level of social mobilization and engagement among citizens. And according to the latest polls, very few citizens support to rewrite the constitution.
You speak in the very precise language of a political analyst, and I want to ask you a more ethereal question. How do ordinary Colombians talk about this government?
Well, there is a strong feeling of rejection. There is also a strong feeling of dissatisfaction. Basically, both among those who voted for Petro and among those who did not want him in power. In the first group, there is this deep sense of being basically betrayed. There are some people that the government has fallen short on their expectations or on their campaign promises, particularly those regarding social welfare and living conditions. I think that this government has managed to put in the public debate certain issues, social issues that have been challenging over the past 3 or 4 decades, but Colombians have started to gain knowledge and conscious about those issues, and those topics are becoming part of conversations under a negative light.
Well, let me ask you one more question about the economy. I started off asking about sentiment among investors. And look, we have a lot of investors who listen to this show. It inevitably ends up being part of our focus. But I did want to ask you what the economy has felt like for most Colombians, kind of at the grassroots, over the past 2 years compared to previous years.
Well, living conditions for most Colombians have historically been very challenging. Most Colombians continue living paycheck to paycheck. Those traits remain largely unchanged. under Petro, also because his most ambitious, his flagship social policies and social reforms will be implemented in the long run, so their results will be perceivable maybe in 5 to 8 or even 10 years. But on the other hand, we also see that there is a small segment of Colombians who have a very privileged living condition. Those Colombians so far have not seen a significant deterioration in their living conditions, despite President Petro announced that he would pursue a tax reform, a tax overhaul, taxing those high income earners the most. So that we have seen also mixed results on that front.
What do you think the most positive accomplishment of this government has been so far?
We might have positive, very positive outcomes in several fronts. The first, I would say, is that this government has put at the center of the public agenda and public debate some structural issues that Colombians have been facing over various generations in terms of social welfare, social inequality, and those structural issues will persist with or without Petro. And acknowledging this reality is a first necessary step before addressing those challenges. I think that is a relevant result or a relevant outcome from this government is that Colombians are discussing social inequality, are discussing poverty, gender equality, are discussing peace in rural areas. And those issues had remained under Colombians' radar for many years before this government. So, and those are social demands that are well substantiated by evidence, data, and social living conditions in the country. Second, regarding policy results, I think that this government has achieved to slowly, gradually, but steadily improve employment rates. Also, I think this government has made of environmental issues and environmental policies and climate change policies a structural element of policymaking and state policies.
I mean, the official data shows deforestation in Colombia fell 36% in 2023 compared to the previous year. In the Amazon region specifically, it was down 38%. So that's progress.
Absolutely. That's a very positive trend that hopefully prolongs over this year and the coming years. That's a very complex issue, but hopefully that positive trend continues this year and the coming years. And hopefully the government sustains those policy efforts that have conducted to these positive results.
We'll be back after a short break. The Americas Society Art Gallery in New York City is a spectacular place to see art from Latin America. The gallery is currently showing the city's first ever solo exhibition of the Argentine artist Alejandra Sever. The show features the artist's colorful abstract work, which includes, believe it or not, a mini golf course for visitors to play while looking at the works. The exhibit is on view only until July 27th, 2024, so hurry up and get here. The Americas Society Art Gallery is at 680 Park Avenue in New York. So let's talk about security. I mentioned that this was the other big area for this government, and here the results have not been as good.
President Petro has outlined his total peace, Paz Total initiative to simultaneously negotiate peace with very diverse group of non-state actors. And this has delivered, as we have stressed during our conversation, mixed results.
What about it would you point to as positive? Because I hear, frankly speaking, I hear mostly negative things.
Yes, total peace definitely has reached significant milestones. First of all, it reached the first ever peace agreement with the National Liberation Army, which is formally the last rebel armed guerrilla group in the country. This is a political milestone, but also a political milestone that will probably translate into humanitarian reliefs in many areas of the country due to the bilateral ceasefires that the government has not only agreed upon with not only with the ELN but also with other groups. And this leads me to the second positive outcome of total peace, and that is that there has been a significant reduction on some violence forms, violence modes in some areas of the country. And despite this might seem modest in this course, this has a very tangible effect on the living conditions of those communities that live in conflict stricken departments, in conflict stricken areas.
What's the picture like nationally with regard to security then?
Well, we also have a mixed picture. Security indicators have improved significantly in most urban centers this year. In the five major cities, Bogota, Medellin, Barranquilla, Bucaramanga, and Cali, we have seen a significant reduction in homicide rates during the first quarter of 2024. We have also seen a significant reduction in kidnap incidents in those cities of about 60% overall. But in parallel, we have seen the intensification of armed confrontations and turf wars among non-state actors along the Pacific coast, particularly in Valle del Cauca, due to the reaccommodation of forces along the value and logistics chain of drug trafficking. We have also seen that, for instance, these groups, non-state groups, both rebel groups such as the FARC dissident factions and criminal organizations, have been reinforcing their control tactics over communities through, for instance, extortion and violent intimidations, mobility restrictions, and those modes of violence have indeed increased, intensified in Bajo Cauca, in Antioquia department, in South Bolivar, in South department, in South Bolivar department, also in Cauca, Valle del Cauca, Chocó. So this is due to the very complex nature of violence and conflict dynamics in the country. There is not a single actor driving those trends, those dynamic, and the government has failed to implement a comprehensive security strategy in parallel to peace negotiations in order to address those challenges and those non-state actors in several regions of the country.
As we reach a conclusion here, Laura, what I'm hearing kind of across the board from you is that this is a government that arrived in office 2 years ago with visions of transformational change, and to some extent still has those intentions. But on the economic front, on the security front, they've enjoyed some areas of success, but they've not been able to really execute their vision for a variety of reasons, in part because of just, energy behind the status quo, because of the challenges of Colombia's security situation that successive governments have struggled with, the increase, we didn't really get into this, the increase in cocaine production that has just funneled billions of dollars into the hands of organized crime groups, whether they're rebel, quote unquote, rebel groups or just ordinary drug cartels, but also because of the checks and balances in Congress and Petro's popularity itself. Do you think that that status quo, which is really just, again, this idea that whatever Petro's plans might be, he will struggle for different reasons to implement it, and that Therefore, it's, again, this is me extrapolating, it's not that risky an environment at the end of the day to invest in, to operate in. Do you expect that to generally hold for the second half of his government? Or is there anything that might change the situation?
What could change and what is maybe changing at this moment is, well, the sense of urgency this government has to implement those transformation and those reforms and those changes. And as that sense of urgency increases, the government and President Petro's rhetoric or discourse or tactics to achieve those transformations might become more erratic, might become more improvised, and the political cost of that improvisation or of that high level of dispersion will probably open the way for an opposition political project to reach the presidency in 2026. Petro could resort to several actions. A group in the institutional pathways that are currently in force in the country, and another set of actions that are extra institutional pathways are outside this legal and institutional frameworks. Regarding the first set of actions within the current institutional framework, he could increasingly resort to executive actions to bypass Congress and oversight agencies, but all those executive actions are still subject to review by the Constitutional Court. A second resource that he has is one that he has already expressed to pursue, which is a constitutional overhaul. However, this pathway is extremely lengthy, extremely complex in terms of time and political capital, which he lacks. And this initiative would still have to go through Congress. Another pathway is to pursue re-election, which is legally not viable at the moment in Colombia. He would have to overhaul the constitution. Again, he would have to pass through Congress, and the balance of forces of power there are not favorable for the approval of such an initiative. Now, regarding the extra institutional or de facto ways to achieve his policy goals, there is a caveat here, and it is that we have not seen so far any express intent to pursue any of these actions or resort to this repertoire of possibilities. One would be to enact an auto coup or remain in power, blocking oversight and checks and balances institutions. We haven't seen any discourse or actual decision pointing to that way, but that is still a possibility. Another possibility is also to reject 2026 election results. We have seen there are some precedents in the region with Trump and Bolsonaro, and even if that is a plausible scenario, it is highly uncertain to achieve his main goal that would be to remain in power. And the last one would be to call for mass mobilizations, a call for people to flood the streets, which he has done in the past. He has insistently called for his supporters to mobilize and press Congress to approve his reforms, but this has not delivered the results he has intended. So that is basically the set of possible actions that he could resort to should his frustration increase in the coming 2 years, but we do not see any signs of a potential authoritarian or democratic backslide during the rest of Petro's term. He would most likely resort to executive actions to continue pushing for his agenda.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's what you're saying is some uncertainty, some stability. We've all just got to keep our eyes open and continue to follow this story. Which is, if ever there was an ad for the importance of political risk and for people who watch these things, that's kind of it. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ podcast.
Thank you very much, Brian. A pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.